Midnight had come and gone in the stale confines of Lagos Women's Correctional Facility. The usual sounds of shuffling footsteps and echoing cries were now silent, replaced by the soft hum of the fan sputtering in the corner and the faint tap-tap of water dripping from a broken pipe. Cell Block D was darker than usual tonight. Fluorescent lights had dimmed, and most inmates were asleep, exhausted from the day's mundane, repetitive routines. But in one corner, shadows danced in the dim light, where 4 women sat cross-legged on worn metal bunks. Each carried a different story, each weighed down by memories that had driven them to this cell. Ada, with her strikingly high cheekbones and narrow eyes that once held a fierce determination, now looked tired, resigned. She took a deep drag from a cigarette shed smuggled in with surprising ease. The glowing ember briefly illuminated her face, casting sharp lines across her features. As she exhaled, the smoke spiraled upward, filling the air between them. She glanced at Miriam, sitting beside her with her arms wrapped around herself. Miriam, who looked almost regal even in her faded prison uniform, was watching Ada with an unreadable expression. Next to her sat Gloria, a tall, solid woman who radiated a quiet strength. Tola, the youngest among them, was huddled in a corner, her wide, anxious eyes darting between the others. "A cigarette, after all these years?" Ada murmured, passing it to Miriam, her voice barely above a whisper. She leaned back, her face softened by the dull light. "First time I've had anyone to talk to who might actually understand." Miriam took the cigarette, her eyes never leaving Ada's. She exhaled slowly before speaking. "This is what it's come to, eh? Sitting here, in prison, finding comfort in strangers." Across from them, Gloria chuckled softly, her deep voice filling the silence. "I don't think we're strangers anymore. Not in here." Her eyes softened as she looked at each of them. "Talking is all we have left." The words hung heavily in the air, echoing off the cold cement walls. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, with a resigned sigh, Ada leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "Well, I'll start then." She took a breath, her voice steady but carrying a note of defiance. "My name is Ada, and I'm here because I killed my husband." The other 3 women froze, absorbing the weight of her words. The casual way Ada spoke, the matter-of-fact tone, made it clear she had relived this moment countless times. Gloria leaned forward, her voice gentle but curious. "Why don't you tell us your story?" Ada looked down at her hands, scarred and calloused. She closed her eyes briefly, her lips pressed into a thin line as if trying to keep her memories from spilling out. "All right," she said, her voice soft but filled with an undercurrent of pain. "It started when I was barely 20. Ada's voice cracked slightly as she began, a painful hesitance marking each word. "When I first met Chike, he was everything a young girl like me could dream of," she said, staring off into the distance, lost in a memory. "Handsome, charming, and so attentive. My family loved him, and me? I thought I was the luckiest woman in the world." Miriam nodded, a knowing look in her eyes. "They all seem perfect in the beginning," she murmured, almost to herself. Ada's lips tightened as she continued. "Our first few months together were a dream. We laughed, we danced, had bring me gifts, flowers, but then, little by little, things changed." Tola leaned forward, her eyes wide with curiosity. "How?" Ada took a deep breath, clenching her fists as if to steel herself against the memory. "At first, it was subtle. He started to criticize the way I dressed. 'Why would you wear something like that, Ada? Don't you care what people think?' I thought he was just protective, maybe even a little jealous, but it got worse. Soon he was picking fights over everything. The way I looked at people, the way I cooked, the way I spoke." Gloria listened, her eyes narrowing with anger. "Did he ever?" Ada nodded, her eyes hardening. "Yes, and it wasn't long before he began hitting me. Just little things, at first, pushing me, grabbing me too hard, but it escalated. One night he came home late, drunk, and found me talking to my sister on the phone. Before I knew it, he grabbed the phone, smashed it, and..." She paused, rolling up her sleeve to reveal faint scars along her forearm. "He said he was teaching me a lesson." The cell was silent, the other women listening intently, their expressions a mixture of horror and understanding. Tola's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. "How? How could he do that to you?" Ada's voice grew colder, more detached. "After that, he made sure I was completely isolated. I had no friends, no family. He was all I had. I was trapped, afraid, and ashamed. 8 years I stayed. suffering, hiding bruises, lying to myself that things would get better. Miriam reached out, squeezing Ada's hand. "But you left, didn't you?" Ada shook her head slowly. "Not exactly. One night he came home in one of his rages. He was angrier than usual, accusing me of things that made no sense, and then her voice cracked, but she forced herself to continue. He told me I was worthless, that I didn't deserve to live. He threatened to kill me." The other women gasped, and Gloria clenched her fists in anger. "So I did the only thing I could think of. I fought back. I grabbed the closest thing I could reach, a kitchen knife. And she trailed off, her voice thick with emotion. When it was over, I knew I'd never be free. The neighbors had heard the noise, the police came, and I was arrested. Ada's voice faded and she looked down at her hands, now trembling. For a moment, silence filled the cell, the gravity of her story weighing on each of them. Miriam shifted uneasily, glancing around the room. She took the cigarette from Ada, inhaling deeply, as if the smoke might fortify her. "I didn't end up here the same way," she began slowly, her voice tinged with sadness. "My husband, Emeka, he was a good man. I loved him with all my heart. But life has a way of testing you." Tola looked at her, her face softened with empathy. "What happened to him?" Miriam's eyes grew distant, her voice almost a whisper. "Emeka fell ill out of nowhere. We did everything we could, went to every doctor who would see us, but—" She shook her head, her voice breaking. "He died in my arms, leaving me with 2 little children and no one to turn to." The women exchanged glances, each sensing the unspoken heartbreak in Miriam's words. "But that wasn't the end of my suffering," Miriam continued, her tone hardening. "Emeka's brother, Peter, saw my husband's death as an opportunity. He had always envied Emeka, and now, with him gone, he decided he had the right to everything Emeka left behind. He took our home, our savings, left me and my children with nothing." The anger in Miriam's eyes was raw, burning as she clenched her fists. "I went to the police, to the courts, begging for justice. But Peter was well connected, had friends in high places. He turned everyone against me. Soon enough, I was homeless, penniless, and desperate." Ada placed a comforting hand on Miriam's shoulder. "And then? One day, I saw Peter at a cafe, laughing, bragging about his new car. A car he bought with the money he stole from my children." Her face twisted in pain and fury. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I invited him over for a drink, like a good sister-in-law, and I made sure it was his last. The cell fell silent once more, each woman absorbing Miriam's story. They knew that the consequences of betrayal, pain, and desperation often led to choices that could never be undone. As the minutes ticked by, the cell seemed to shrink, the walls closing in around the women as they waited for the next story. Ada and Miriam exchanged a silent look, both understanding that the pain they just shared would never be fully healed, but feeling strangely comforted by each other's company. Gloria, the sturdy one of the group, cleared her throat and shifted uncomfortably. She was usually the one offering advice and solace, but tonight it was her turn to open up. She took a deep breath, her voice low and controlled. "I never thought I'd end up here," she began, her eyes fixed on the grimy floor. "You know, I always did what I thought was right. I worked hard, kept my circle small, and trusted the people closest to me. I thought loyalty meant everything, but sometimes the people you trust most can become the reason you fall." The women listened in silence, sensing the bitterness beneath Gloria's words. "I had a best friend named Jane. We had been through everything together. We grew up on the same street, went to the same school, even got our first jobs together. People called us inseparable." Gloria's face softened momentarily, but the glint of betrayal soon returned to her eyes. "Jane was like a sister to me. She knew everything about me, all my dreams, my fears, my secrets." Tola shifted on the cold bunk, eyes wide. "What happened?" Gloria's jaw tightened. "Jane had always been a bit competitive, but I thought it was harmless. We'd joke about it, you know? Like who'd get a better job first or who'd get married first. It was silly stuff back then. But as we got older, things changed." She leaned forward, her face a mixture of pain and anger. I was the one who got lucky first. I got a promotion, moved into a nicer apartment, even found a man who adored me. And Jane, well, she couldn't stand it. I started noticing little things. A nasty comment here, a snide remark there, but I ignored it. She was my best friend, after all. Miriam nodded, her eyes understanding, Sometimes we ignore the signs because we want to believe the best in people. Gloria let out a bitter laugh. I ignored more than just signs. I ignored the fact that Jane had been meeting with my fiancé behind my back. I ignored the fact that she'd been spreading lies about me at work. And when I confronted her about it, she laughed in my face, told me that I didn't deserve the things I had. Ada clenched her fists, feeling the anger rising on Gloria's behalf. And then what? Gloria's voice grew colder, harder. I couldn't believe the things she'd done. She took everything from me. My job, my man, my reputation. She even moved into my apartment, claiming I was too busy to need it. I lost everything because of her lies. And when I was left with nothing, she had the nerve to act as if I was the one who'd wronged her. Tola whispered, almost to herself, "How could she do that to you?" Gloria's face darkened, the memory etched deeply in her mind. One night, I saw her in town. She was laughing, holding my ex-fiancé's arm, acting like she was living my life, and something in me snapped. I confronted her, told her everything I'd kept inside, and when she laughed at me again, I couldn't stop myself. Miriam looked at Gloria with a mixture of sympathy and sorrow. "So that's why you're here." Gloria nodded, her voice breaking. In that moment, I lost control. All the anger, the hurt, it just came flooding out. I barely even remember what happened, but when it was over, she was gone. The cell fell silent, the weight of Gloria's story hanging heavy in the air. Each woman sat with her own thoughts, understanding that in their own way, they had all been driven to extremes by the people they trusted most. Tola shifted nervously, her young face etched with a combination of fear and regret. She had always been the quiet one among them, the one who watched and listened, but tonight, the others turned to her, waiting for her story. She took a shaky breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have a fancy story like you all," she began, her eyes downcast. "I was just a kid, you know? My parents left me when I was little. I grew up in a foster home, bouncing around from place to place. By the time I was 16, I was on the streets." Ada reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Tola's arm. "Sometimes the streets don't give you much of a choice." Tola nodded, her eyes glassy. "I didn't have anyone, no family, no friends. I did what I had to do to survive. I got involved with a group, a gang. They took me in, made me feel like I belonged somewhere. They were the closest thing to a family I'd ever had." Miriam's face softened with understanding. "Sometimes when you're alone, you'll take whatever family you can get." Tola's voice grew more steady as she continued. "I knew what they were doing wasn't right, but I didn't care. I finally felt like I had a place, like I mattered. We did small jobs at first, shoplifting, pickpocketing, things that didn't seem like a big deal. But soon we started doing bigger things. The other women listened, their expressions a mixture of empathy and sorrow. They understood that Tola had been swept into a world she barely understood, a world that had no mercy for the innocent. One night, Tola continued, her voice trembling, we were told to break into a house, just like any other job, but something went wrong. The owner came home early. I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I was just supposed to be the lookout, but when he saw me, I ran." She paused, tears welling in her eyes. "They caught me. I didn't even get a chance to explain myself. The others ran, left me to take the blame. And now, here I am." Gloria reached out, pulling Tola into a gentle embrace. "You were just a kid. You didn't deserve this." Tola buried her face in Gloria's shoulder, her body racked with silent sobs. "I don't know what else I could have done. I just wanted to belong somewhere. I never wanted this." The other women sat with her, offering silent comfort as they shared in her pain. They understood the feeling of being trapped, of making choices they could never take back. And in that moment, they became more than just cellmates. They became a family. In the days that followed, the four women grew closer. They shared more than just stories. They shared laughter, sorrow, and even moments of joy. They had come from different worlds, carried different burdens, but within those prison walls, they found a strength in each other that they hadn't known existed. Ada became the protector, always watching out for the others, especially Tola. Miriam, with her quiet resilience, offered wisdom and guidance, her words often a source of comfort for her cellmates. Gloria, with her strong will, became the one who encouraged them to keep fighting, reminding them that even in the darkest places there was still hope. And Tola, despite her young age, taught them all a lesson in resilience. She had been through so much, yet she held on to a spark of innocence, a belief that one day things would get better. As the weeks turned into months, each woman began to wrestle with her own demons. Ada found herself haunted by memories of her husband, struggling to reconcile her past actions with the woman she wanted to become. Miriam found herself longing for her children, the ache of separation almost unbearable. Gloria wrestled with feelings of betrayal and anger, questioning whether she could ever forgive herself. And Tola, despite her newfound family, yearned for a second chance at life, a chance to make things right. Together they formed a plan, not to escape, but to survive. They decided to support each other, to find a way to heal, even within the confines of the prison walls. They promised to stand by each other, no matter what. One stormy night, a guard knocked on their cell door, carrying an air of urgency and mystery. The women froze, expecting the worst, but he simply motioned for them to gather closer. "There is an opportunity," he whispered, looking over his shoulder as if afraid of being overheard. "An organization is sponsoring a program to help non-violent offenders reduce their sentences. Counseling, training, maybe even early release if you're lucky." The women exchanged glances, hearts pounding. Could it be real? They had each accepted that their fates were sealed, but this unexpected chance sparked a glimmer of hope. Over the next few weeks, they joined group sessions, sharing stories of hardship and regret. They attended job training classes, though doubts lingered. Ada, once a strong woman who had fought for her survival, found herself facing buried pain as she worked through her trauma. Miriam, the quiet widow, channeled her grief into learning new skills, determined to make life better for her children. Gloria struggled with trusting others after being betrayed, while Tola, the youngest, held tight to her dreams of a life beyond prison walls. Together they encouraged each other, pushing through the challenges and doubts. Little by little, they each began to believe they might actually have a future beyond the cell. Despite their progress, the journey wasn't easy. Each woman had to confront her own darkness. One night, as they returned to their cell after a particularly emotional session, Ada's anger bubbled over. "It's unfair," she said, fists clenched. "We've paid for our mistakes 100 times over, and now, even when we're trying, it's as if they want us to fail." Miriam placed a hand on Ada's shoulder, steadying her. "Maybe it feels that way because we've always been left on our own, but we have each other now. We're stronger than they think." Tola nodded eagerly. "We've come this far together, haven't we? And I know I wouldn't have made it without you all." She looked at each of them, gratitude in her eyes. Gloria, who usually remained reserved, surprised them by speaking up. "You're right. I came here thinking the world had nothing good left for me. But now, maybe we're each other's redemption." The words lingered in the air, carrying a weight of unspoken promises. They understood that no matter what lay ahead, they would face it together. The program reached its conclusion, and the day came when each of the women would face the board, advocating for their early release. Ada went first, holding her head high as she recounted her journey of healing. She spoke of her newfound strength, her desire to work with survivors of domestic violence, and her dedication to ensuring others wouldn't make the same mistakes. Miriam was next, her voice steady as she told the board about her children and her dream to provide for them again. Her words spoke of quiet resilience, a mother's love that had been tested but never broken. Gloria took a deep breath, revealing her story of betrayal and forgiveness. She explained how she'd fought through bitterness, how she'd chosen to let go and rebuild her trust in people. Finally, Tola stepped forward, her voice trembling but her resolve unwavering. She talked about her youth, her mistakes, and her determination to forge a new path, one where she could give back to the community that she had once harmed. One by one, they shared their truths, baring their hearts before the board. Hours passed, stretching out in agonizing silence as they waited for their decisions. Then the news came. All four were granted reduced sentences. Tears of joy, disbelief, and relief flowed freely. They hugged, laughter mingling with sobs as the realization of freedom dawned on them. Standing together in the sunlight for the first time, they breathed in the fresh air, each of them filled with a hope they had nearly lost. They knew the world outside would be challenging, but this time they had each other and a shared promise to help each other build new lives, free from the shadows of their